5. The right to emigrate. The right to emigrate is not normally conceived of as a right, but in terms of the American constitutional background, it has an important status as a right. The Puritans saw themselves as pilgrims and sojourners like Abraham, their destination and citizenship being in that city whose builder and maker is God. Emigration, in terms of this faith, made them the moving force in the colonies. Not only did Puritans settle directly in virtually every colony, but many moved southward in protests against various New England policies or injustices. The faith that made them unyielding in New England made them aggressively missionary-minded in their new homes. Again, New England provided the ships and seamen for America, and these, as they docked in Virginia or the Carolinas, were outspoken in declaring their political and religious faith. Because of this, some colonial governors came to regard New England seamen as pestilential fellows. Furthermore, New England and Massachusetts in particular early took the lead in developing the implications of its faith, probing philosophically, religiously, and politically into the issues of church, state, and faith, and so exercised an influence on the laws and constitutions of the various colonies and states. A brief glance at the Old Testament Commonwealth is necessary to an understanding of this right to emigrate. To the modern mind, the Mosaic Law involved strange paradoxes. It required death for proselytizing to an alien faith, but did not legally require the tithe. Inward faith was not compelled, but an outward adherence to the covenant would not be subverted without treason. Israel was a covenant people. To remain within the covenant and then subvert it was treason deserving death. They were a people established in terms of Abraham's migration and Moses' migration with the people, and the land was the land of the covenant. Each generation either confirmed the covenant or departed from it. Entrance into the covenant was not compulsory, 2 Chronicles 29, but the privileges of the covenant and the covenant land were reserved to the faithful. The climax of apostasy was hence expulsion. This, of course, was the thesis of Michael Wigglesworth's poem, God's Controversy with New England. The beginnings made by the Christian pilgrims and sojourners had been godly. God's throne was here set up, here was his tabernacle pight. This was the place, and these the folk, in whom he took delight. But let New England beware of indifference toward their covenant God, who warns, quote, "Accept you seriously and soon repent. I'll not delay your pain and heavy punishment." Massachusetts was established as a covenant people. Every sphere of life involved either a covenant or covenant activity. Thus, John Davenport spoke of, quote, national, conjugal, social, end quote, and other covenants. 3 covenants in particular are to be noted as basic to an understanding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. 1. The Church Covenant. 2. The Civil Covenant. 3. The Personal Covenant. The Personal Covenant was basic in that it involved the relationship of the individuals to God through Christ. All men were either covenant keepers or covenant breakers, having been created covenant men in Adam. For a covenant people, there was no entrance into the full life of church or state or suffrage in them without mature evidence of membership and responsibility in the personal covenant. The fact that few voted and church membership was limited, both then and well after the Revolution, did not mean that few were considered Christians. Rather, at the beginning, and even later, all or virtually all were assumed to be Christian, although many were regarded as babes in Christ in terms of maturity of faith. The limitation was twofold. Church and state were fearful of immature Christians being lightly given full membership, and individuals were hesitant about assuming mature responsibility regarded by them as awesome without much soul-searching. At times, men had to be urged to assume responsibilities for which religious and civil authorities deemed them ready. Those not in full communion were assumed to be Christian, and their children also. In Wigglesworth's words, quote, "For Christian children are an holy seed," end quote. Thus, in a very real sense, the presuppositions of the halfway covenant were early present in New England, although applied in a different sense. The distinction, however, was only a version of the ancient distinction between catechumens and baptized, with this notable difference. Baptism was now presupposed for both classes as within the covenant, and communion was reserved. It was basic that the people were a covenant people, and the colony a covenant colony of the city of God. The idea of a covenant people, while most prominent in New England, was common to the colonies and to their English background. The basic nature of the Puritan army in England, despite its variety of theological emphases, was its covenantal basis. Quote, "The solemn engagement of the army was a contract of voluntary association, a covenant among the soldiers with the nation and before God," end quote. The language of covenant or compact influenced civil and ecclesiastical polity. As Tocqueville observed much later, quote, "In the United States, the sovereign authority is religious," end quote. Constitutionalism is a form of covenantalism, and it requires for stability the vitality of the personal covenant to supply health and character on the part of the people. Attempts to transport constitutionalism, as to South America, the Mexican Constitution of 1824, a copy of the US Constitution, and to the African states, have resulted in futility. Without the conception of the personal covenant of grace, the civil covenant and constitution is rootless and quickly becomes invalid. Covenantalism saw its origin in the emigrant Abraham and the emigrant people under Moses who left Egypt, the house of bondage, for Canaan, the land of promise. Such a people were the colonial Americans, as preachers of all churches and colonies reminded them, and as the colonists reminded themselves. American history can be described as, quote, "the American pilgrimage," end quote. Freud could declare in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, 1922, that, quote, "the goal of all life is death. Life is but the circuitous route to death," end quote. But Americans could believe that they had been led to a promised land which was a figure or type, as was Canaan, of their true city or land, the eternal kingdom of God. Isaac Watts, Jordan, declared, "There is a land of pure delight where saints immortal reign. Sweet fields beyond the swelling flood stand dressed in living green. So to the Jews old Canaan stood while Jordan rolled between." Other hymns written in or popular in America celebrated this same faith. "Shall we gather at the river? I'm bound for the land of Canaan. I'm just a poor wayfaring stranger. Deep river," and the like. The 19th century saw even more hymns expressing this faith. Many hymns exulted in the attainment of the promise by faith. "I've reached the land of corn and wine, and all its riches freely mine." This exultant note is characteristically American Christianity. The struggle, suffering, but exultantly triumphant pilgrim. Emigration, then, was basic to covenantalism, and, with emigration, the right to establish a godly society and institutions in terms of that faith. Thus, the right to emigrate and to establish then a new covenanted body was basic to this faith. The freedom not to contract or covenant was recognized, which meant separation in terms of that descent. There was thus the right to leave the jurisdiction of contract or covenant, but not the right to breach of contract, which constituted subversion and apostasy. The problem with Roger Williams and the Quakers was their insistence on trying to subvert the covenant rather than establishing their own. Covenantalism strongly emphasized liberty of conscience, but it was not the anarchistic interpretation common to the 20th century. Thus, according to the Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 20, quote, God alone is Lord of the conscience, and hath left it free from the doctrines and commandments of men, which are in anything contrary to his word, or beside it, in matters of faith or worship, so that to believe such doctrines or to obey such commandments out of conscience is to betray true liberty of conscience, and the requiring of an implicit faith and an absolute and blind obedience is to destroy liberty of conscience and reason also. End quote. The Christian conscience is responsible to God. The humanistic conscience has no transcendental responsibility, but answers only to itself or any self-established norm it pleases. The Christian conscience is ready to wage war in the state and be a pilgrim in terms of God and covenant. The humanistic conscience wants the state to indulge its total license as a personal privilege. The Christian conscience expects tension and clash with the world and peace with God. The humanistic conscience works towards peace with the world and independence from God. The Christian conscience thus calls for pilgrimage throughout life and sees life as a pilgrimage and an emigration. The right to emigrate was cherished from the beginning in Massachusetts. During a 2-year period, because of fears of losing their charter, fears of Indian attack, and a sense of helplessness because of limited numbers, there was some abridgment of the right, which was later legally secured in 1641. In 1633, the issue came up in the Newtown case. The right to emigrate was denied by a majority of the magistrates, but upheld by the majority of deputies to the General Court. John Cotton preached a sermon in support of the magistrates, and the matter was settled by compromise, additional lands being given to the Newtown people. Expediency thus prevailed. In 1635, Stoughton, a deputy, was punished for writing a treatise opposing the magistrates' position. However, the magistrates conceded the right to emigrate to the people of Roxbury and Watertown, but required at the same time that they remain under the jurisdiction of Massachusetts. The popular discontent with this position, so alien to their presuppositions, led in 1641 to Article 17 of the Massachusetts Body of Liberties. Quote, every man of or within this jurisdiction shall have free liberty, notwithstanding any civil power to remove both himself and his family at their pleasure out of the same, provided there be no legal impediment to the contrary. End quote. This principle of law was widely copied, although Virginia sought to discourage such emigration. North Carolina entered it with limitation into its Declaration of Rights. Legally or practically, there was a steady acceptance of this right to emigrate, and a surrender subsequently both of claims to the country and of western lands to such emigration. The Northwest Ordinance of July 13, 1787, was the triumph of this principle. It forbade not religious establishment in the new territories, but rather molestation, quote, on account of mode of worship or religious sentiments, end quote, Article 1, and firmly guaranteed the civil encouragement of, quote, religion, morality, and knowledge, end quote, Article 3. Passed again by Congress after the ratification of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, the Northwest Ordinance undergirded this right to emigrate. The right to emigrate is thus in the Constitution by virtue of its limitation to express powers only, and by virtue of the freedom to erect new states in Western territories. The powers of the separate states and the right of each state to establish or disestablish a church made possible a concept of the right to emigrate and create new social orders within the framework. The state was thus the area of social theory and particular commitment and experimentation, and the federal government the area of unity in terms of abstinence. It is in this context that the First Amendment was written. Clergymen in particular were hostile to ratification of the Constitution until assured that there would be no federal establishment of religion. Others, like John Adams, wanted state establishment, but were equally hostile to federal establishment. The religious and political sovereignty of parliaments had been alike oppressive in the years prior to 1776, and no such authority in either realm was desired in America. Establishment in some form or another continued in some areas throughout the 19th century, and in New Hampshire, suffrage was religiously restricted into the 20th century. Nevertheless, very early, men like the Reverend Isaac Backus opposed all religious establishments, as his Church History of New England makes clear, while espousing a Christian republic. The consequence of this was the retention and development of particular cultures by the various states, with the integrity of variations within the counties also recognised, sometimes by plural establishments. The United States thus presented a genuinely and extensively pluralistic picture. To this day, half the counties in the United States are dominated by a single religious denomination, so that a particular area is Baptist, Roman Catholic, Congregational, Lutheran, etc. in character. Again, racial and national groups, German, Polish, Swedish, Armenian, Dutch, etc., have tended to colonize in particular areas, so that an extensive coincidence of religion, race, and culture prevails within the counties of the United States. The 14th Amendment has been instrumental in undercutting the vitality of this right to emigrate and to colonize, in that it has provided grounds for federal interference in states and the nullification of state laws embodying particular differences, religious or political. The increasing demand for uniform, federally imposed divorce, traffic, and criminal laws is hostile to the right to emigrate and to local authority. It is significant that of late some religious colonies suffering from federal persecution are considering emigration outside the United States. The Canaan and refuge of pilgrims is becoming their house of bondage. The freedom of movement or emigration went hand in hand with an insistence on the validity and necessity of local responsibility. The two are inseparable. The very belief that a local group is decisive in its self-government and faith is important to the impulse to colonize and to experiment in government. Spanish and French colonies were weak in this motive, whereas the English colonies were either founded in terms of this faith or quickly developed it. Their ultimate claim to independence from parliamentary absolutism was a corollary to their emigration and their religious interpretation of that fact. The right to emigration meant cultural pluralism, not a national state. Modern interventionism is political, economic, and religious, but non-Christian and anti-Christian, and seeks a unitary state. The decline of the personal covenant of grace is a prelude to the decline of personal responsibility and the rise of statism. Significantly, New England men remained zealous colonizers and settled the West. Indeed, American history can be viewed, as has been done by Chard Powers Smith in Yankees and God, as successive if waning revivals of Puritanism and the colonization by and conversion to Puritanism of the United States. Smith dates the four Puritan revivals as follows: 1630 to 1660, 1700 to 1760, 1800 to 1860, 1900 to 1930, and the periods of decline: 1660 to 1700, 1760 to 1800, 1860 to 1900, 1930 to 1960. Again, it can be viewed as, quote, a contest for local autonomy as well as one for individual liberty, end quote. Contempt for the feudal and pluralistic origins of the United States is the hallmark of statists who call for the repression of, quote, so-called grassroots democracy to maintain a genuinely pluralistic society, end quote. Carriel's pluralism is the plethora of bureaucratic agencies. This is not the American heritage, but a modern revolution within the form, steadily seeking to destroy the American structure. The New England men, in their westward migration, revealed a zeal to establish schools and colleges, institutions, associations, societies, and churches which very early made them leaders in the Western states. As Tocqueville noted, quote, "We were assured in 1830 that 36 of the members of Congress were born in the little state of Connecticut. The population of Connecticut, which constitutes only 1/43rd part of the United States, thus furnished 1/8 of the whole body of representatives. The state of Connecticut, however, only sends 5 delegates to Congress, and the 31 others sit for the new Western states." End quote. By 1860, a fourth of the population of Greater New England, that is, the United States apart from the South and Southwest, but inclusive of California, were, quote, "pure Yankees," end quote. This migration has sometimes been written off as purely economic, that is, Yankees left the limited soil of New England and moved west to improve their lot. This opinion rests on the myth of the settlers' ability to live off the wilderness. The romantic myth of bounteous nature holds that man had only to move into virgin territory to live richly and well. Actually, most Indians lived very meagerly, often on animals repulsive to white men, and sometimes starved. Indian bands within a tribe were often a handful, and each band required a wide expanse of territory and much migration in order to survive. Game was scarce in most areas, with some exceptions. Passenger pigeons were numerous, but not even seasonal in their migration. Buffalo were important, but no tribe could live in their pathway. Deer were not plentiful, and rabbits were scarce until the white man cleared the forests and created fields and grasslands. The abuse of some natural resources has been real, but the improvement of many even more notable. A near continent barely supporting a few 100,000 Indians now supports an ever-increasing population. Grasslands grow richer grass, and most farmland has increased in fertility. The abuses have been real, but statist propagandists and champions to the contrary, they are far from being the whole story. From the beginning, conservation and improvement have been practiced. The romantic reading of history sees the Indian as a dedicated conservationist, forgetting that the Indian was heedless of the future and ready to set fires in order to drive game into his hungry hands. The statist reading of history bypasses the evidences of early American problems with the land in order to argue for state interference and control. As Mallon has observed with reference to the grasslands, the most vivid description of a dust storm dates from 1830 in what is now north-central Kansas, when the Indians were in full possession. Dust storms are recorded for 1850 to 1900 in numerous accounts. It is the, quote, "most brazen falsehood ever perpetrated upon a gullible public," end quote, to ascribe the dust storms of the 1930s to, quote, "the plough that broke the plains," end quote. The settler needed capital to migrate westward, supplies to keep alive a year or two, seeds, livestock, chickens, tools, and time both to clear the land and to improve it. His first harvests were often poor, and the soil took time to develop and often needed time, rotation, and enrichment. As he developed his land and its fertility, game flourished near to it, and the game then began to attract Indians, who found deer, rabbits, and other such game closer to the white man than to the wilderness. But the settler could not depend on game for his table, and the vegetable bounty of the new country was even worse. Capital was thus a necessity, plus hard work, patience, courage, and faith. Possessing these things, Americans moved to possess the land and, in biblical terms, to inherit it. Immigrants from Europe in later years had to settle in similar fashion. Many a couple came to America in steerage and then sank the bride's dowry in Western land and in supplies and equipment to develop that land. The settlers were families, and the wife and children hard-working members in a difficult venture. The lone frontiersman was a trapper, always well-stocked with provisions, or, after the Civil War, an ex-soldier, often Confederate, drifting into mining camps or towns dominated by large land and cattle companies to act as a paid agent in warfare against the settler. The settlers were men with the frailties of men, often discouraged, ready to demand help as a right, ready to repent emotionally at revivals and camp meetings, but also men whose venture required capital, courage, patience, and faith. They were immigrants who had forsaken relatives and city to colonize, and the motive for colonization often appealed to was a religious sense of destiny, to possess a continent as the chosen people of God. In the Monroe Doctrine, this concept was applied to all the Americas in that they were designated the area of self-determination. Henry Clay hoped that the United States would be, quote, the head of the American system, end quote, as it spread throughout the Americas. It was hoped that, inspired by the example of the United States, Latin America would throw off its old world shackles and become, with its head, the truly new world. In this respect, the Monroe Doctrine failed to attain its purpose. Cotton Mather had believed that the New England colony would spark a blaze destined to re-illumine a darkened world with a new and greater reformation. The survival and abuse of this hope has a long history in the United States. In its perversions, it has been a messianic faith. In its health, it has been the summons of the pilgrim Christian, bound for the celestial city, to others to join him in that pilgrimage and the blessedness of a pilgrim's progress. William Stoughton, 1631 to 1701, expressed the sense of grace and also of boldness in grace which has characterized the American pilgrimage in an election sermon of 1668. Quote, as for our advantages and privileges in a covenant state, here time and strength would fail to reckon up what we have enjoyed of this kind. If any people in the world has been lifted up to heaven as to advantages and privileges, we are the people. Name what you will under this head, and we have had it. God sifted a whole nation that he might send choice grain over into this wilderness. Thus it hath been with us as to grounds of divine expectation, and therefore let us, in the fear of God, learn this great truth today, and receive the instruction thereof sealed up into all our souls, that the great God hath taken up great expectations of us, and made great promises to himself concerning us, and this hath been, and is, New England's day and season of probation. End quote. Timothy Dwight, 1752 to 1817, in The Conquest of Canaan, 1785, saw Americans as a new chosen people called by God to possess the land. Quote, arise, go over this Jordan, thou and all this people, unto the land which I do give them. End quote. Joshua 1:2. This poem, immensely popular and influential in its day, underscores what many scholars tend to ignore. The colonials were not individualists seeking individual rights, but a covenant people waging war against political and ecclesiastical absolutism in terms of a covenantal conception of law, liberty, and authority. They were emigrants and pilgrims, and America was their promised land. They looked confidently to the future, therefore. It is a significant and melancholy fact that their descendants now look nostalgically to the past, a perspective not calculated to ensure victory.